Morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. Thank you so much for joining the Masterclass on Inclusive Business and Human Rights. My name is Peter Nestor. I'm Director of Human Rights at BSR, and I'm joined on the call by my colleague, Michaela Lee, and by Paula Peleas, who's the head of the Business Call to Action. And she'll talk a little bit about Business Call to Action's organization and the work that they've been doing to support inclusive businesses and their interest in putting out this webinar series. Thank you for joining us. I have good news, which is that we are doing a 7-webinar series over the course of the next 2 weeks. Today is not 7 webinars back to back. Today you've signed up for just 1 hour. And the topic today is on Human Rights in Business 101, an introduction to business and human rights, the UN guiding principles, and how human rights impacts businesses and what we're seeing businesses do to respond to that, how they're building management systems and management structures to proactively identify issues as they arise and build human rights into what they're doing in their core business. We have a really full agenda, a lot of material to get through today. We are recording this webinar, so if you happen to be multitasking, you can always go back to the Business Call to Action website and pick up if there's a part that you'd like to go back and listen to again, or if you'd like to share it with anyone else in your organization or in another organization that you know about. This is made publicly available by Business Call to Action and something that we're very proud to be partnering with them on. But just wanted to make sure that everyone knows this will be recorded. So the plan for today, just a very brief overview of BSR, Business Call to Action. We'll then dive into the content on human rights in business, what some of the issues are, and some of the drivers, some of the reasons for why businesses care about human rights, and specifically why your business, why all businesses should care about understanding and managing human rights issues. We'll then get into the nitty-gritty in terms of building a human rights program. What do we mean when we say a program that's aligned with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights? And we've got some good practice examples from both large and small companies that are starting to embed human rights into their business practices. We'll close with just a very brief summary of what you can do next after this webinar. We hope that your interest in business and human rights does not fade after we close this particular webinar, but there are a lot of tools and resources that we're going to point you to so that you can get started. Real quick, just about me. So again, Director of Human Rights at BSR. I've been here for 7 years and have been advising companies, primarily large multinational companies, on how to understand human rights, the human rights impacts for their business, and how to build management systems that address those human rights issues. My colleague Michaela Lee is joining me here today as well. I think just in the interest of time, I might just move along. Michaela will be joining us on all of these webinars and jumping in her areas of expertise where I don't necessarily have the same level of experience. So you will be hearing from both of us throughout the webinar series if you are able to join us. Very briefly on BSR, we are a nonprofit organization. We are global. We're technically headquartered in San Francisco, where Michaela and I sit. We have offices in New York, Europe, and throughout Asia as well. We work with companies on a broad range of sustainability issues, corporate social responsibility issues, everything from climate change to supply chain to human rights. You can learn a lot more about the organization at bsr.org, and feel free to contact us at any time with any inquiries about us or what we are doing. Paula, I will turn it over to you to give just a brief overview of Business Call to Action and the platform that you are leading.
Perfect. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you. So the Business Call to Action, for those that are new to BCtA, we are a global inclusive platform. We are advancing solutions towards the SDGs, particularly supporting companies to implement inclusive business, which we define as those businesses that, as part of your core activities, involve low-income communities. We're an alliance of different partners, including the governments of Finland, of the Netherlands, the UK, Sweden, and the Swiss government, and we are housed within UNDP. One of the things that drove us to do this alliance with BSR for this masterclass on human rights is that understanding that inclusive business, no matter the size of your company or no matter the location where you are implementing it or the sector in which you're at, you are dealing with vulnerable communities. And that carries a lot of responsibility as it does as well opportunity for positive impact. This is where we thought, this is the anniversary of the 70th Human Rights Declaration, and it is a reminder of how important it is for all of us to renew this commitment to respecting and promoting human rights. So that's where we're coming from, and we hope that you can all take a lot of advantage of these masterclass. As Peter said, it's a global public good, and we hope that you can share it as much as possible and help us embrace it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Paula. And two more things for those on the line. This is an open session in terms of being able to ask questions and jump into the conversation. I think the easiest way to do it, if you are dialed in, feel free to take yourself off mute at any time and jump in with a question. I don't mind being interrupted, and so please feel free to come into the conversation at any point. If you're on the webinar platform here, there is a hand-raising function. If you look right next to your name in the top right corner, you can press that little hand. That'll signal that you've got a question, and we will take you off mute and invite you into the conversation. You can also feel free to either send a chat message to me or Michaela, who's hosting this webinar, and we can bring you in that way too. Real quick before we get started, what else are we going to be talking about on these other webinars? So we're planning to do deep dives into a number of different industries, and then do an overview of data protection and privacy issues that affect all companies. And then the final webinar will be an overview of the toolkit that we've developed and will be making publicly available for companies to manage human rights and build human rights programs. On Thursday, the 18th, we're looking at food, bev, and ag. Next week, on the 23rd, we're looking at consumer goods. On October 25th, we're doing financial services. October 30th is infrastructure, utilities, and energy. And then October 31st is data protection and privacy. And on November 1st, we will be going through the toolkit. Okay, that's the plan for the entire series. Before we get started, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so business and human rights, an overview. What are we talking about here? So what we've got up here is a couple of pictures of issues that might be human rights issues for business. And the point that I want to make here is that sometimes the issues are really, really clear. The Rana Plaza factory collapse was one of the most recognizable and unfortunate human rights issues that impacted business, not only Rana Plaza and other businesses inside Rana Plaza, but the global brands that were sourcing from Rana Plaza and other factories in Bangladesh. So sometimes they are really obvious, but sometimes they're not as obvious, and that's partly why the UN adopted the guiding principles and has been encouraging businesses to proactively identify what those issues are. Child labor is an issue that might be affecting a number of companies, at least somewhere in their supply chain. This particular picture is of a small child working on an artisanal mining operation, but in some cases, again, it's not always easy to tell how old workers are or what industries they might be working in, and so this is definitely a human rights issue, and one that businesses are and should continue to be concerned about. Some of the other issues are not as clear. This is a picture of one guy on the bottom right hauling some coal, I think, in northern China, and the top guy working on a field looks like an average field worker. But what you might not know about these two people is that they have both had their passports confiscated. They have no access to a grievance channel or a grievance mechanism to complain about that and to complain about any other health and safety working conditions that they might be facing. So, the human rights issues are not always front and center to the business. Sometimes they take a little bit of investigation and talking to people, talking to workers that we don't usually talk to about what their situation is and trying to figure out whether or not they might be in some kind of a vulnerable position or one that raises a human rights issue. So maybe just to back up and cover a question that you might be asking yourself, what the heck are human rights anyway? And where do they come from? Yeah, I think the best way to describe human rights is that it is a code of conduct for human beings. It's the only group of rights and principles that we've agreed on a global basis are the baseline expectations for how we treat each other. The document that Paula referred to earlier, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is the foundational document. It was signed in 1948, and as Paula mentioned, this is the 70th anniversary of the UDHR. So that's where I would start, where I would point you to if you want to get a sense of exactly what human rights are. There's a lot of other legalistic language around all of the conventions and treaties and other documents that have brought the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to life. But from the business standpoint, and just to keep it simple, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides the 30 rights that at least provide the foundation for what human rights are. We've got a couple slides here on exactly what those 30 principles are. And you'll notice a couple of things. One is that they cover a really broad range of issues. So everything from freedom of discrimination to number 8 on the left side here, remedy by tribunal, to number 15, you have the right to a nationality to be recognized as a citizen of a country. And so they are going to cover a broad range of issues. The other thing that you'll notice here is that they're going to apply to governments. And that's important, is that the primary driver for respecting human rights and protecting human rights and enforcing human rights, it's with countries, it's with states, right? And the idea is that, or the idea back in 1948 was that as long as we can agree as an international system, as a number of different countries coming together on what these basic principles are, then it's the duty of the state to incorporate those principles into their laws and enforce them. What's happened, as we all know, is that some states have done that more than others, and even states that have done it a lot have done it in ways that are unique to their own cultures and their own societies. And so there's very different ideas, for example, about what the right to free expression is or the right to freedom of opinion is, say in the United States versus other countries around the world. Sometimes in that particular case, the United States is very different from what many other countries have adopted to be their own laws on free expression. But what's also happened is that a lot of countries have not adopted human rights issues, and so when the guiding principles in the UN were trying to figure out and provide some guidance for companies on what to do in these cases, they went back to the human rights standards, and they said, you know what, it's important that companies get the basics right, that they understand that there are impacts that companies also have on human rights. It's not just for governments, and that there is a duty for companies to respect human rights, not necessarily to protect human rights. That's for the states. But there is a duty to respect. So a couple others that I'll point out here that are particularly relevant for businesses. Number 3 on life, liberty, and security. Number 4, freedom from slavery. You may have been following the legislation that has been passed in the United Kingdom, the UK Modern Slavery Act. We have a similar piece of legislation out here in California, and they will be adopting one in Australia a little bit later this year, prohibiting modern slavery, which is an issue that we've known about for a while, but we're starting to get a little bit more clarity on as those issues come into light. So that's a human rights issue as well, and one that certainly affects businesses. A couple of others here, freedom of opinion, number 19. Also number 23 is a big one, right? And this really captures all of the workplace rights that everyone is entitled to. It's not just the right to work, it's the right to have desirable work and to join trade unions. Number 25 is also important, that you are entitled to an adequate living standard. In most cases, that is being paid the minimum wage, but we're starting to see more of a push towards a living wage, which is important and, again, is grounded in human rights. So that's a broad survey of what some of the issues are that we are talking about. So what's the link to business? It turns out that human rights can impact businesses in a lot of different ways. What you'll see in this diagram here is that if you think about the company in the orange circle in the middle, there are human rights issues all over the place, right? So everything from sales and marketing, depending on who your customers might be. You might be doing business with some customers who are in high-risk businesses or potentially doing some nefarious activities that you would want to know about. It certainly comes up in the products that you sell and make. If you're a food and ag company, the product is the actual food, and it depends on how that was made and where it came from and what the labor and working conditions were like for the people who produce those products. Supply chain is a big one that affects all companies, regardless of the size, and it raises a number of different workplace rights issues, and also the right to remedy and the right to raise a grievance that everybody has. So I would think very broadly in terms of when you're trying to get your head around how do human rights affect my business? Think about all aspects of your business, not necessarily just what you're selling or what you are marketing. So I've mentioned the UN guiding principles that provide the global standard. These were adopted unanimously by the Human Rights Council in 2011. It's very difficult to get the Human Rights Council, as you might imagine, to do anything unanimously, but the guiding principles were the product of several years of engagement and listening and crafting a document that met the needs of a lot of external stakeholders, folks from the international NGO community, other international organizations, and the business community was consulted quite a bit on developing these standards. So they're intended to be very pragmatic, they're intended to be workable for business, and they are intended to provide a light forward for how does a business manage human rights issues. They do not add any new human rights. They simply reference back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and several of the other conventions that have brought those principles to life. And as I mentioned, they just provide a path forward for how to manage and understand human rights. They are intended to be flexible and intended to be fit to your operating circumstances. So there may be some things in the guiding principles that don't necessarily resonate or make sense. That's okay. It's better to just get started. Excuse me, just get started. Do what you can in terms of adopting a policy, trying to understand what your issues might be. But if you start looking at all the different criteria they have for what a good grievance mechanism is, and you think, gosh, that is just way too much to take on for what we're working on right now, that's okay. This is intended to be the start of a journey. It is not intended to name and shame or call out companies and say, every company has human rights issues and we got to get this thing solved by the end of the year. No, not at all. The idea here is start down that path, call a friend, call other advisors, call other people who are working on this. As you run into hurdles along the way, every company will run into hurdles along the way, and it's just important to get started and sort of stay on that path. So that is particularly why a lot of businesses have adopted the guiding principles or committed to them. There's three parts to them. This protect pillar is intended to reinforce to states that they have the primary duty to protect human rights, to enforce human rights. As I mentioned, businesses have the responsibility to respect. The basic articulation of that responsibility is to know and show, so understand where your human rights impacts are, and don't infringe on them if you think there's a risk that you might infringe on them. And if you are, then the idea is to stop, obviously. But that can be easier said than done in some cases. Because it's sometimes difficult to determine whether or not you actually have a human rights impact. And then remedy is that both the state and the business, where it's found that you might be infringing on human rights, that you provide a remedy. Let me give a very concrete example there. If you're in a business where you are providing a barrier to your workers from joining a union, for example, the remedy there would be to remove that barrier and to make sure that your employees or workers know that they have the human right to form and join a union. So this doesn't have to be remedy in terms of a big judicial process. It's just in terms of making it right for whatever the business, for whatever the victim has been going through. a couple other linkages here that we wanted to point out. So some of you might be members of the UN Global Compact or know about that organization. They have also committed to advancing human rights through business, both in Principle 1 and Principle 2. They have a lot more information on their website about their programming on human rights, and we're going to reference one of their key resources, a great free resource on called the Business and Human Rights Dilemmas Forum, which I would highly recommend folks to check out. Probably also very familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been developed. These are 17 goals to advance sustainability throughout the world. There has been a call for business to partner with states on achieving these goals. And what we've also found is that doing good human rights work is also advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. We've had a lot of companies come and ask us, hey, you know, should we have two different programs, right? We want to do a good job on the SDGs and we want to do a good job on human rights. It turns out doing a good job on human rights is going to get you pretty far along the path of implementing the SDGs. So we've pointed out here just areas where human rights come into play with the SDGs. You'll notice a lot of these coming off of SDG number 8, decent work and economic growth. So I mentioned the right to join a union, freedom from slavery, right to fair working conditions, adequate wages. I think also gets back to number 1, no poverty. But human rights are fully ingrained and embedded in the SDGs. So wanted to just be sure to make that link. You know, Paula talked a little bit about an inclusive business. Paula, do you want to just come back online here, maybe go a little bit deeper in terms of how you're thinking about inclusive business and how human rights is really a part of what the business call to action is doing to advance inclusive business?
Sure. So as I was saying, the way we define inclusive business is it is a commercially viable business. It's scalable, and it is engaging low-income communities, those that we say are at the base of the pyramid. And it can do so by engaging them as producers or suppliers or distributors or consumers, employees, or even shareholders. Of course, you know, in order to have that positive impact, at a very minimum, the companies are expected to have compliance, a minimum compliance around human rights and other environmental and social issues. But more so, we see them as impactful businesses that are contributing to promoting respect for human rights, that are contributing to increasing accessibility and affordability, and many issues that cross-cut with some of these human rights issues that we're discussing today. The respect for their privacy, the respect for their freedoms. So that's sort of at the core of what we're aiming to discuss today as well.
All right, very good, thank you. And we've got just a couple of examples here. I'll pause on this one just to give you a sense of how some companies are linking SDGs and human rights. This is a company called Little Sun. They make small solar lanterns and distribute them out through emerging economies. They have made social impact a key part of their business. They've linked up here to a number of different pillars that they have in their organization around environmental sustainability, education, energy access, gender equality, and poverty eradication. And on this slide, what we've tried to do is show how that links up to the SDGs and to human rights as well. So if you take the education pillar that they have, as they say in their material, giving a brighter future to kids who are off the grid, so empowering education outcomes by providing light to these folks, right? So advancing SDGs number 4 and 10 specifically, and also the right to education and the right to be free from discrimination, which may occur if you are at a disadvantage and cannot access educational solutions. So this is one example. We've got others from some other companies sprinkled throughout the deck, and a lot that you can find on some of the resource websites that we will point you to. Just a couple of slides here to show in real life how this has come up for a number of companies. There's been a lot of focus right now on the fishing industry, particularly in Southeast Asia, although it occurs in other parts of the fishing industry around the world as well. A number of organizations, in this particular case Human Rights Watch, had done some research to uncover what was going on in those regions and published reports that highlighted how large businesses are benefiting from these forced labor conditions and how those are in their supply chain. So that's affected an entire value chain, and we've seen even some lawsuits that have come out of that particular area. Another example here where it's affected is, small businesses at the commodity level all the way up to big businesses. In this case, Amnesty International had published a report identifying a number of instances of child labor and forced labor on palm plantations, primarily in Indonesia and Malaysia. There's a lot of focus, I think, on palm right now, again, partly because some of these groups are out there looking for this stuff, but it's not just the big organizations, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. This stuff can come up in a lot of different ways, and what we've seen is that, especially in a world with social media where sort of everyone can be a journalist, and these types of issues can go viral very, very quickly. So that's one reason we've seen, at least with the companies we've been working with, the desire to get ahead of these issues, to not be on the front pages of a Human Rights Watch report or a New York Times article, and to understand what they are before somebody else does. But they are certainly real. All right, so what are some of the other reasons that we think businesses should care about human rights, and especially inclusive business and some of the smaller businesses? Often SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises, are overlooked when it comes to providing guidance on emerging international standards, sort of expect that it's just going to flow down the value chain, and that some of the big companies that do all of their work on adopting policies and doing training programs will just give that to their smaller suppliers, and that obviously doesn't happen all the time. Most companies, as you'll see on the next slide, get frustrated that they're not getting any support on how to meet these new standards or how to do things that a lot of the big buyers want them to do, and so that's partly why we're doing this today. But SMEs, of course, do care about human rights, and all of the inclusive businesses on the Business Call to Action platform are already doing good human rights work to some extent, and a lot of that has to do with the company culture. This graph is from a survey that was taken by the UN and the ILO a couple years ago, trying to get a sense of why SMEs might start caring about human rights, and wanted to understand what their current state of play was. Company culture is really important, and then it quickly tapers off to attracting and motivating employees, or it's often a CEO, right, or a founder who is very excited and passionate about this stuff. So that's why they do it. It's kind of hard to create a company culture, but again, we're hoping that by providing some resources for people inside these companies, you could take these back and use them to help spark an idea if you work at a company where there isn't necessarily the culture around doing these kinds of programs, or you don't necessarily have a founder or a CEO who's into it. We hear a lot of feedback from companies that investors are asking quite a bit about human rights, asking whether or not companies are managing human rights. There's a new corporate human rights benchmark, which is the first time that a group of investors have come together and actually ranked companies, mostly large companies, across industries on their human rights performance. They ranked them last year for the first time, and will be publishing an updated ranking later this year. But it's also important for small businesses. As we were preparing for this webinar, we did a number of interviews with small businesses to ask them about human rights and why they might care about it. And one of the member companies that we spoke to said, hey, I run a small business in Rwanda. I was recently at a conference in Geneva, and every single investor wanted to know how we are implementing the SDGs and, by extension, implementing human rights. So for small companies that are trying to grow, access to capital, access to investor capital, at least from the international players, they're going to start asking about human rights and the SDGs, and we'll certainly want to see that it's a part of the company and it's a part of the company culture. I mentioned earlier that we have seen some lawsuits come up around this, both for big businesses and small businesses. I've put a couple of the companies on the bottom left here who have been involved in some of the more high-profile lawsuits. Interestingly, a lot of these companies are also now leaders in the big corporate world on doing business and human rights. So in some cases, the lawsuits have helped. In other cases, it's just been part of the company that they wanted to get ahead of that risk and have now become leaders. On the bottom the bottom right-hand side here, I've put a couple of the seafood suppliers that, in this case, were suppliers to Walmart that were implicated in a recent lawsuit here in the United States. So it's not just people targeting the big companies, it's also some of the smaller companies that we're starting to see get involved in some of these lawsuits too. Consumer demand, finally, right? What is the purpose of business? You got to meet your consumers where they're at. We're starting to see some examples where consumers have started to demand these kinds of products or respond very positively when they do. Unilever is a good example. They've acquired a number of brands, which they now call their sustainable living brands. These brands have grown fast. They've contributed quite a bit to the revenue for Unilever. Ben & Jerry's is a famous one. Seventh Generation is another famous one. And Unilever, in their public documentation, sees these brands as being a key part of their portfolio going forward. On the small business side, again, a business call to action member here, Raven and Lily, is front and center, putting their commitment to social impact and human rights on their website. They're marketing to consumers based on the source of their materials, the source of their ideas for their clothes, and running a business based on respecting human rights. Just in the interest of time, I want to move ahead to a couple of the other slides. We've got some other reasons here that companies support human rights. Better to have engaged employees, avoiding future risk, and avoiding negative brand reputation. I'll let you take a look at those. And at this example, a little bit more on your own. If you happen to be at a computer, or will be shortly, BSR runs a program called Her Project, where we are going into factories in emerging economies and delivering a number of different programs targeted towards women, and finding that there is a very good business case for doing so. This ROI in the top bullet point here, for a $1 investment in a Her Project program makes a return of $4 for the company. It comes in reduced employee turnover, employees that are more efficient when they're working, happier when they're working, and staying there longer. So there is a lot that you can find on the website to learn about Her Project. It's an example, though, of how, again, smaller companies are embedding human rights into their programs. I talked a little bit about the frustration that we've heard, that others have heard from smaller companies in terms of trying to implement these standards. This was a recent survey, research project from the Joint Ethical Trading Initiatives among 1,500 suppliers, and what they found, reading the bottom statistic here, is that 48% of those suppliers received no help at all in terms of implementing the buyer's codes of conduct. So there is an obligation, I think, among some of the big companies to help smaller companies who are not as well resourced usually to get this stuff right. And so, some of the companies we talk to a little bit more regularly, we're working on that with them too, and trying to get them to step up a little bit more and support human rights throughout their supply chain, not just in their business. Okay, let me just pause here and see if there are any questions before we jump into how we're seeing companies actually build a human rights program and follow the guiding principles. I'm just going to be quiet here for a few seconds and let anybody come in with a question, or feel free to raise your hand. Okay, very good. I think there is still a lot of material to get through, so why don't we move forward? I should say you should also feel free to email us. We've got our email addresses on the website with anything if you would like to know a little bit more after the webinar. So we're in this pillar of respecting human rights. What do companies do? We have broken it out into 6 key elements that are required to implement the guiding principles. Number 1 is understanding human rights risks and impacts. So conducting what's usually called a human rights impact assessment, but it's also other forms of human rights due diligence are fine as well. Number 2 is adopting a human rights policy. Number 3 is educating your employees on human rights. Number 4 is embedding human rights in the business. Number 5 is being as transparent as possible and putting some reporting out there on what you're doing on human rights. And then number 6 is thinking through remedy and making sure that where there are impacts that are found, that victims are made whole again. So we're going to take each of these in turn and unpack them a little bit and provide a few examples. So number one is understanding risks and impacts. So it's identifying what the human rights impacts are and trying to determine what your company's responsibility is in terms of meeting that human rights risk. Let me give you a concrete example that we hear about from a lot of different companies. In some companies, they use both employees to do work, but often they'll bring in subcontractors or contractors to work alongside them. And so what you'll find in a factory setting is employees who are paid often a little bit more than the contractors, and they're often given other health benefits or social welfare benefits that the contractors are not entitled to. Or not necessarily entitled to. And so is that fair? Is that something that a business should be allowed to do, right? To pay someone who's doing basically the same job, to pay them a little bit less, and to not give them the social benefits or the other benefits of working as they would their own employees if they're working right next to each other, right? So maybe in some cases that might be okay, or there might be reasons why you're doing that. Maybe it's a short-term project, maybe it's to meet some demand, a buyer's demand, or it's to, it's just seasonal workers that are coming in that, might not be there full-time. Maybe there are other cases where they are full-time workers and the company should actually reflect and think, wait a second, is this really the right thing to do? But there is a question of, okay, we've identified a potential human rights issue here, both on the right to be free from discrimination at work, but also the right to adequate living standards and right to desirable work conditions. But it's not always clear what the responsibility is for companies. So, again, there are some resources we can point you to out there, and we'll continue to go through some of these examples as we get into our industry deep dives over the next couple weeks. So we'd welcome you back here to start thinking through some of those responsibilities. But the first step is to figure out what those issues are for your company. And it is also, I want to make sure to point you to this bottom box here that says prioritize to your business. So in addition to being a very pragmatic standard, the guiding principles encourage companies to prioritize human rights issues. So take the ones that are the most severe first, that have the worst impact on people first, and try to address those before you address all of them at once. And that's totally fine to do. That is what is encouraged. Again, recognizing that at the same time that all of the businesses want to respect human rights, they also have a business to run, and that is very important to do. And so, trying to fit this into the business operating context. This is a screenshot of the tool that will be made available very shortly. We are finalizing our toolkit. We'll get it up on the website on the business call to action very shortly, and then on November 1st we will do a webinar that will take us through the toolkit. But it's a pretty straightforward process, and the idea here is just to give you a worksheet that you can start to do some of the prioritization and analysis on what the most important issues might be. So there's an identification of the human rights issues. We've got this populated with some of the areas in the business that this usually comes up. Is it an opportunity to advance human rights, or is it a risk that might be posed to the business? In the guiding principles, severity, this concept of how severe is a human rights issues, it comes down to three different factors: scope, scale, and remediability. We've got them on the bottom left part of the slide here. Scope is how many people are affected. Scale is how bad is the impact. Is it, say, losing life potentially, or losing a limb, or a serious bodily injury, or is it being denied access to join a union, or missing pay or late pay or that sort of thing? You're entitled to all of those things, but we can say that there are some that are going to be a little bit more important, right? Loss of life and limb is going to be more important potentially than the right to join a union, so we want to prioritize those first. And then remediability is whether or not the victim can be made whole again. Is this something that can be remedied? So we also take a look at management. A lot of companies already know what their human rights issues are, or have a good sense of what they might be, and they've already got some programs in place to make sure that people get paid on time, or to make sure that people have health and safety equipment so that they are not at risk for bodily injury. So you want to take that into account when you're doing your prioritization analysis as well. This is one of the resources I've mentioned. This is from the Global Compact. I use this all the time. It is a wonderful repository of really deep dives on these specific issues that tend to affect businesses more than some of the other human rights issues. I've got forced labor highlighted here. You can go to the website, click open one of the issues that you might be interested in, and you'll find a great explanation of what the issue is, how it impacts business, what the scope of responsibility is, and it will point you to some tools that you can use to help identify or figure out what you could do about that issue or whether or not it's one that people find in your industry. All right, number 2 is articulate your commitment. Consider adopting a human rights policy or a statement. If you Google human rights policy, you will, or Bing, I guess if you are a Microsoft user, human rights policy, you will find a lot of good examples that are starting to emerge. Again, on the website back here, the Business Dilemmas Forum, you can find some examples of human rights policies. The other resource I would point you to is called the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. They are collecting a lot of different examples of policies, due diligence, templates, lots of training and other free materials, and then all of the issues and news that come out on the business and human rights field. So they're a great organization and one that's available to all as well. A lot of people know what the point of a policy is. It is not enough to just adopt a policy and then say you are implementing the guiding principles. There's a lot more that comes that comes behind adopting a policy, but it's a great place to start. It can articulate your commitment to human rights. It can set forth what the issues are that your company is working on and provide a common platform for all of your employees, all of your suppliers and other business partners, customers, to know what your position is on human rights and know what you're doing about that. So it can be just a very nice way to establish, hey, we are a business that is respecting human rights. In our toolkit, we have a policy template that we would encourage you to adopt that should at least get you started, and it'll point you down it'll point you to some other examples of companies that you can find that have human rights policies. We recently did a study at BSR on how many companies now, at least the big ones, how many of them have human rights policies, and we have finally tipped over 50%. Among the top 100 companies in the US and Europe, 56% of them now have a standalone human rights policy. If you look over to the box further to the right, an additional 27% of companies that we looked at do not have a standalone human rights policy, but they reference human rights in other documents. So if you add those two percentages together, it starts to get up around 75–80% of companies are now thinking about and actively aware of what their human rights issues are and are putting those out publicly. So again, when you get a chance to take a look at this slide deck, I'd encourage you to go find some of those companies and see how they have done it. This is the basic checklist that we've got. What is a human rights policy supposed to look like? First of all is getting the commitments right. So we, as a baseline, encourage companies to obviously set forth that they respect human rights, and it's important to reference and get in writing that the UDHR is providing the baseline starting point, but then also, if possible, to reference some of the other conventions and ILO documentation that's out there. That's what best practice is starting to look like. It is always best to get somebody senior in the company to sign off. The most powerful policies and the ones that have the most persuasiveness are ones that are signed by the CEO. What we also like to do is have companies commit or identify and articulate how human rights impacts their business. So demonstrating in their policy that they have done some of the due diligence and to understand what the issues are for their company, that they've gotten in under the hood and actually said, you know what, we're not going to just put up the policy that we found online, but we actually are going to make this one that comes specifically from our company. A lot of other links and things you can do in the policy to other existing programs, but again, I would encourage you to try to find a good one and model it based on that. Number 3 is educating employees. A key part of the guiding principles is spreading awareness inside the company about what human rights are. We're not expecting, nor do the guiding principles expect, that everyone within the company is going to become a human rights expert, but there are some ways that you should be able to translate to your employees to say, look, we know what human rights are, we are a company that respects them, and we expect you as an employee of this company to align with that, to align the way that you conduct yourself at work and conduct our business as a company. We want it to align with our commitment to human rights. A few years ago, I published this note called, probably the longest title in the history of written papers, Designing Effective Human Rights Training Aligned with the Corporate Responsibility to Respect and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. That's a free resource that's available on the Global Compact's website. They have some other free resources as well. This is an example from a engineering and construction company, formerly known as CH2M, where they put up a poster around their operations on modern slavery and wanted to make sure that people knew exactly what it was, how to spot it, and what to do about it if they have a problem. I would recommend an organization called Stronger Together. They're based in the UK. They have put together some really good free off-the-shelf posters like this that you can get, print out. They also have some videos if you're looking to do video training for some employees. Really good off-the-shelf material that is available for free. Number 4 on embedding. So this is the hardest one, obviously, to do. This is where the rubber hits the road, and it is how do you actually build human rights into the way that you do business. So, you know, again, kind of a couple of the other steps here, identifying business risk areas. Hopefully you've already done that, but this is where you start to get into building the management systems or making sure that people know what their targets are, their objectives are to meet their human rights commitments, and then having systems in place where you can monitor and improve how they are doing on those systems. I've dropped in a couple examples here. And again, sort of feel free to take these and modify them as you'd like. This is how we do it at BSR when we're advising companies and helping them come up with a human rights strategy where they are looking to embed these principles within their operations. This is a one-slide snapshot of what we call our human rights action plan. Usually the action plan will include about 10 to 12 of these issue briefs, and they get really tactical and really operational. So in this particular case, this is a piece of work that we did for a technology company. We had identified artificial intelligence and big data as a potential risk. So we had at the top, what's your goal on this particular issue? Where do you want to be in 3 years to be able to manage this issue? What are the benefits? What's the business case for doing this? Who are the topic owners within the company? What are the KPIs that you could start managing toward? And then on the bottom, it's what are some of the short-term actions, really concrete things that you could take within the next year or two to get this program moving, and then what are some of the longer-term actions that you can take just to keep your eye on the ball and where you eventually want to go. I should also note that again, getting started on human rights is the key. It doesn't have to be perfect. This is going to be weird. It's going to be awkward for companies to some extent to start talking to their employees about how they respect human rights, but it's important to just get going and make sure that you can meet your employees where you're at, where they're at in their own knowledge and commitment on this stuff. One of my mentors always says it's better to get runs on the board, better to put a score up, then get some momentum, rather than trying to hit a home run every single time. So it's okay to do sort of short-term, long-term action planning just to make sure that the company gets going on this stuff. This is another example, just as you're developing your own materials, of a type of action plan that we've developed. It's an Excel-based sheet and allows the company to monitor a little bit closer what's happening with in terms of meeting their KPIs. I dropped in a few slides here. I think just in the interest of time, again, I'd encourage you to take a look more at what we're doing on her project on the website. I think it's herproject.org. But it's a program that we're taking inside factories to do a lot of embedding of human rights. So it's a lot of training, it's a lot of capacity building with senior managers at factories. It's going in and looking at the business processes, strengthening the way that these companies are run, and then eventually delivering on our human rights impacts. And we've collected here some ways that it's benefiting women in these factories, but then also how it's actually benefiting the businesses. So what you see here is workplace performance, 93% decrease in payroll costs. There's on the bottom here, 4.5% decrease in turnover across 37 different factories. Number of different other sort of business factors that are making these businesses better run and more efficient, so that we are finding that there is a really good business case to doing this. All right, 2 more here, and then we'll get wrapped up for today. The number 5 is to be transparent as much as you can. You will start to see that some of the companies that are establishing themselves as leaders in the business and human rights field are publishing standalone human rights reports. I think we have Unilever here, on the next slide. Unilever has put out a couple of reports, 50, 60 pages, that detail all of the different things that they are doing to respect human rights and to implement the guiding principles. I find this particular report to be one of the best out there. It's almost a playbook on how to implement the guiding principles. They give a ton of good examples of what has worked and what has not worked for the company, so they're very honest in their reporting, which I think leads to the credibility. I know for a lot of smaller businesses out there, it's very time-intensive and resource-intensive to try to put out an annual report, or let alone some kind of a sustainability report or a human rights report. So I don't want to encourage and say that every company has to put out a 50-page human rights report like Unilever. No way. There's a lot of different ways that reporting can come out, right? It could just be in your customer engagements. It could be a quick page on your website. It could just be as you're out and about talking to other companies, attending other types of conferences, that you're mentioning the fact that you are a company that is implementing the guiding principles and respecting human rights. That's good reporting too. The idea is just to make sure that we're all helping each other learn along the way. And number 6, last but not least, is providing remedies. So, we talked a lot about the state duty to protect, but there's also and that involves providing judicial tribunals and making sure that people have access to a judicial tribunal where they could get remedy. But in many cases, that's not possible, or it's not effective. And so we are also seeing companies start to set up grievance channels and think through, again, what their responsibility is to provide a remedy. In some cases, it's really easy, right? If you have somebody who's hurt on the job, you have an obligation to take care of them. But in some of the other issue areas, it's not always easy. So I would encourage you to consult, to consult some of the free resources out there, or Paula and Yvonne at the Business Call to Action will be able to help you kind of think through some of these issues and point you to some other resources. I should say, during our interviews, one of the comments that came back was, hey, it would be really great if we could have a forum where we could talk about this stuff going forward. And so one of the ideas that we're kicking around, and would love to hear from you if you'd be interested in something like that, is something where it's either online or remote like this, but once a quarter getting together and trying to talk through some of these issues. We do that at BSR with our member companies. We have a human rights working group, and we meet about 3 times a year and close the doors and say, hey, this is really hard. How are you thinking through this, and how are you solving these problems? And so we're thinking about potentially starting something like that as well. In terms of grievance mechanisms, it's a lot of times we think about it's just a hotline, and I think one of the key lessons that has come from the Me Too movement has been that hotlines at companies probably don't work as well as we think they do, that people are not always willing to call them, and that there are still a lot of problems that come up. What I want to try to do here on just a couple slides is say there's a lot of different ways that grievances can be raised, even more so now. If you look at this middle column with some of these informal grievance mechanisms, companies sometimes will get called out on Twitter or social media, and it becomes very public. But there's also third-party ways that grievances are raised. From the guiding principles standpoint, there's a part of it when you take a look at the guiding principles, you'll see in Principle 31, the last one, that there is or the second to last one, that there is a list of what an effective grievance mechanism is supposed to look like. And it has 8 of these criteria. So it has to be accessible, it has to be predictable, it has to be legitimate, it has to be transparent, rights compatible, all these different things. They're all very important, but it's really complicated and hard to get a grievance mechanism to meet all of them. So I've circled the 3 here that I think are the most important to get started with. Make sure it's accessible. Make sure that it's in a language that people speak. And if you're working in an area where there are no cell phones or email, put a Dropbox out there, right? Or ask, actually, which is number 8, engage with your rights holders. Engage with people who you'd like to hear from or who you want to make sure are protected, and ask them how they'd like to raise a grievance. We've often found that in many cultures it happens in a lot of different ways that we're not necessarily familiar with, but it's important not to just go in with our mindset and think that that's going to work for everyone. Another example here just from the Unilever report where they have gone through and they will, they indicate what kinds of grievance mechanisms they have rolled out throughout their supply chain. So again, a really great free resource there that I would point you to. Couple next steps. All right, we got 1 minute left here, and so let me just say, if you have found this to be interesting, if you think that this is something you might want to do, again, we will get the toolkit up on the Business Call to Action website very, very shortly. I would encourage you to come back over the next couple of weeks and join one of the webinars that may resonate most for you, or depending on the industry that you're in. Developing a human rights policy is not difficult. If you can get a good sense of what your issues are, then the policy is a quick step right behind it. Consider a simple impact assessment, again, using a rapid human rights impact assessment tool. I've mentioned these resources along the way: the Global Compact, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. The 4 companies that I've listed here are considered to be some of the leaders on business and human rights from a number of different industries: Unilever, Marks & Spencer, Microsoft, and Barrick Gold, a Canadian gold company that's done a lot of very interesting work on issues in the mining sector. Looking at your grievance mechanism is another way to quickly come up to speed and quickly get some runs on the board in terms of making progress on this. There can be some quick wins that you can pick up just by tweaking the grievance mechanisms based on, again, accessibility, predictability, making sure that people know what happens, that they know what happens when they call the hotline or access the grievance mechanism. Yeah, and then finally, just a call to join us as we continue to do this. And again, these websites or these webinars will be posted. We wanted to provide you with a survey to come back on here, although I think we might have to just leave this in the slide. So when you access the slide deck from the website, you can fill out a survey here. We'd love to hear from you whether you found this helpful and what we can do to improve. Let me just pause. I know we're right at the top of the hour. We're going to lose some folks here, but if there's anyone who has a question and would like to come into the conversation, I'd be happy to take one before we close here. Okay, good. I don't see anybody coming in here. I know we've put a lot of content into the room. I hope you will have a chance to digest this and work through it on your own. Again, feel free to reach out to us at any time. Our email addresses are on our website. Paula, thank you very much for joining me today and, again, for hosting this series. And we look forward to talking to you again in 2 days if you want to come join us for the Food, Beverage, and Agriculture Deep Dive on Thursday. Wherever you might be in the world, I hope you have a great evening or a great day, and look forward to talking to you soon. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.